Hello, Quinn. Welcome to the show. It's really nice to meet you. I'm glad that you agreed to come on Conflicted. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
I am sweating bullets for a couple of reasons, Quinn. First of all, there's a terrible heat wave impacting England at the moment, and I don't have air conditioning. So, dear listeners, if you're watching this on video and I'm sweating, that's one reason why. The other reason is, and at the outset, I just want to come clean about this. I'm rather nervous about this conversation because, well, why? First of all, well, we're here to talk about your work in general, specifically a book that you published last year called Hayek's Bastards, subtitled Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. And we'll also be talking a little bit, at least, about your most recent book, Muskism, A Guide for the Perplexed, which I haven't read. I have read Hayek's Bastards, and the reason I'm nervous is I'm not very good at economics. Economics slightly bedevils my mind. What I'm aware is that people have very strong views on it, and yet they always couch those very strong views in the language of maths and science, and yet they can reach such totally different conclusions, leaving someone like myself kind of bewildered. Like, this isn't really how physics works. You can kind of trust that physicists aren't going to punch each other in the face when they disagree about physics. But economists and economic historians like yourself, they do. They really disagree, but they purport to be basing their ideas in sort of objective fact. So that's confusing for a regular guy like me. But mainly it's because temperamentally, and I can only say temperamentally because I'm not a very political guy, but temperamentally, I'm not a man of the left. I'm sort of temperamentally a man more of the conservative disposition, right? So when I was reading Hayek's Bastards, I was aware this is a guy who's a man of the left. It's animating his work. And so I thought, oh God, is this going to be like some kind of fight? Because I never want to have fights. I just want to chat. So that's why I'm a bit nervous. But you are a man of the left, Quinn. What is your sort of ideological background, your development as a person?
Well, I mean, it's probably helpful to point out first my disciplinary background because I, too, am not an economist, nor am I even really an economic historian. So in the United States, there's a funny situation in which economic historians of the card-carrying variety tend to be employed in economics departments, actually, separated from the rest of their brethren. And they often have training as economists as well, sort of doctrinally, so to speak. And then they use historical methods to answer questions that are important to economists. And that wasn't my training, that wasn't my background, and that ends up being actually fine, I'm sure, as we'll get on to with the book itself, because, in fact, the titular character of the book, Hayek, I would say after the 1940s, isn't really an economist either. He's been described by some of his best biographers, including Bruce Caldwell, as much more of a political philosopher. And again, as I'm sure we'll be talking about, he has a kind of magpie-like quality to his intellectual development that is very much of the kind of Viennese coffee house variety that is, Catholic in his interests, small c, and very interdisciplinary by reflex. And Hayek, and indeed the whole Austrian school that ends up following him, is also allergic to the kind of quantitative methods and the turn to game theory and econometrics that has now really swallowed the practice of economics in the United States and also even in places like Germany and Austria too. So we don't have to worry about that part of, feeling conflicted, I guess, because I won't try to hit you with the my economic science proves my point bludgeon. That's never been one I've had available, and it's one I'm usually more interested in trying to, dispossess people of rather than to try to use myself. As far as my my own kind of socialization or politicization, it does end up being, I think, relevant to the topic of the book too. The book, actually, the title is an homage to a book called Voltaire's Bastards, by a Canadian intellectual named John Ralston Saul
Great
that
book.
I
Great
read.
book. Mm.
Okay, right, you've read it. So,
Oh,
I
yeah.
read it as well as a teenager, and it was one of the first like kind of big ideas books I read. I mean, I was reading a lot of literature in my teens, very self-serious, wannabe intellectual type stuff.
I
A
have
lot
no
of,
idea what that feels like, Quinn.
yeah. I mean, there maybe we'll be on common ground. Um, Jean-Paul Sartre, the Russians, whatever I could get my hands on from the used bookstore that looked heady and deep. And then I came across that book because it had just come out at the time, talking about the mid '90s, and I just loved the way he wrote essayistically to kind of use this idea of rationality or reason, and then show how it had been bastardized through rationalization and rationality as applied to things like war fighting and the organization of the workplace. And so the arc from a Voltaire to a McNamara ended up being, something one could write your way through. And that, so as a method, I was very excited by that at the time. And in a way, it never left me. I think that that's still kind of what I do is I practice that kind of argument-driven, essayistic, intellectual history.
Yeah, so a historian of ideas, but then
Mm-hmm.
your own, let's say, political
Mm-hmm.
commitments. I mean, I think
Right.
they play a role, surely.
They do. I mean, in the book I published in 2018 called Globalists, I get into this a bit in the preface or the acknowledgments. I was in college in Portland, Oregon in the late
Oh,
90s.
that's it.
And
You've given the game away, Quinn. Portland, Oregon. I
yeah,
know what you're going to say
Portland, Oregon.
now.
There we
In the
go. The
90s,
birthplace
no
of
less. Oh, goodness.
Yep. Yeah, the good old 90s. And I was not by disposition much of an activist at that age anyway. History then, and in some ways now too, tends to be more of a quietist or kind of, intellectually critical but not activist field in comparison to in the US things like, let's say, ethnic studies or women's and gender studies or sociology even, where people will be more likely, literally, community organizers on the weekend and then academics during the week kind of thing. But in the late 90s, there was this little thing you might have heard of called the WTO
Oh, yeah.
meeting in Seattle in
In
1999.
1999. Yeah.
And we're talking about like 3-hour drive from where I was in Portland. And a lot of my cohort were heading up there, and they were, getting ready for the big protest. And I remember of someone I knew, my old like lab partner from biology, like making a big paper mache red fist that he was going to, strap onto a backpack and walk around downtown Seattle wearing. And when they went up, of course, it was a kind of epic, now kind of historically important clash in the streets. Ended up, shutting down the WTO through the direct action conflict and the overreaction from the police and so on. And they all came back, shell shocked, these sort of war stories, and some of them had spent nights in jail. And it was the first moment where I think I was kind of like jolted into a sense of being in the course of history taking place, that there was something important happening, which was a kind of fight over what globalization meant and should mean. And I was observing from the sidelines, and that was a slightly uncomfortable feeling for me because I felt like I should have a stake. I should have a stance. Like, what am I defending the people inside the building, or am I on the side of the people in the streets? I don't want to just be wishy-washy somewhere in the middle unless I've really thought about it. And,
That's really where we part, because I'm very
Okay.
wishy-washy, kind of on the fence.
yeah, I mean, well, the way that I ended up solving this problem is also, maybe ended up me also making peace with my own quietism in a certain way, because I became a historian of the people who my friends were protesting against. So, rather than saying, let me figure out what all the, the grievances in the sweatshops and the, the degree of, coral reef devastation or biodiversity loss or whatever is, as some people I knew did, I said, like, what was going on in the heads of the lawyers and the negotiators who were inside the hotel, arguing for the next round of WTO legislation and rules. And that's really what the book Globalist that came out years later was about. And it was the beginning for me of writing the history of neoliberalism as an intellectual movement. In that case, in an arc from the Austrian Empire at the end of the First World War all the way to the 1990s. It does end with Seattle. And trying to ask the question, why would people argue for something like one world economy? What were they motivated by? What were they opposed to? What were their blind spots, etc. And that was my politicization, I suppose, and it's continued from there through the opposition to the Iraq War and so on.
It's safe to say that throughout that research, you adopted a critical view on those developments. You're not in favor of this thing called neoliberal globalization on balance. Is that fair to say? I mean, I'm not either, so that's not a gotcha question.
Yeah, I think that is fair to say. I mean, I think that it's always contextual, right? I mean, you, as a historian, you look at what other people are saying, and then you want to correct the most egregious errors that are being circulated, or you want to fill in a part of the conversation that's absent. So the reason I hedge it like that is that when I did that book started early 2000s, the discourse about globalization was very weak. So Martin Wolf types, Financial Times, that were just like, globalization is good, it's great, it's better for everyone.
Thomas Friedman, baby.
Right, exactly. Rising tide lifts all boats. And then you had people who were angry, but often, I think, not giving the full narration from inside the belly of the beast that they were describing. And so I was like, okay, here's my strongest critical take on the long arc of neoliberal globalization. Nowadays, it's so common to argue against neoliberal globalization and in favor of nearshoring, protectionism, economic nationalism, that I actually sometimes find my impulse pushing me in the other direction, not for neoliberal globalization per se, but to say, hold on, let's not abandon the idea of commerce over borders, of exchange over borders. So I think, where I'm intervening often depends on where what seems to me like the ignorance is the most thick, and I go in there.
Well, let me just give you a little overview of my own intellectual development, because it was weird reading Hayek's Bastards. I was also born in the late 70s. I grew up in California, in the suburbs, to a kind of very standard lower middle class Republican voting Christian family. I, in the 90s, felt increasingly like that environment was pretty uninspiring, and had what I now would think, with the help of some therapy, a kind of narcissistic ego inflation experience, like a lot of young men have. Like, I wanted to be a kind of intellectual guy, and I found myself, through the advice of some professors at college, sort of initially enchanted by the work of the perennialists like René Guénon. Like, these are serious, reactionary, hierarchy-obsessed traditionalists, right? And that led me weirdly to Greece, where I joined a monastery, became Greek Orthodox, totally wacky. Then 2001 comes, 9/11 occurs, and in the midst of that, I swing and become obsessed with Noam Chomsky and that kind of critique of the American empire, which actually at the time felt like it overlapped with that more reactionary critique of the modern world that I had already absorbed. So basically, massive critiques of the global order, which identifies America and Britain, capitalism, finance, etc., as just evil, terrible.
Yeah, against modernity, kind of.
Against modernity, yeah. And then and then I kind of had a brief, more romantic phase. D.H. Lawrence, Richard Wagner. You can imagine the kind of young man I was, a real hoot at dinner parties. And then the financial crisis occurred, and my kind of blog reading turned me on to the Austrian School of Economics, which at the time, and this is the period of the Tea Party movement in America, etc., at the
Ron
time
Paul,
seemed to offer very historically grounded and rigorous explanation of what was going on. And so then Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Murray Rothbard, eventually and most crazily, Hans-Hermann Hoppe and his strange idea of libertarianism best provided by an absolutist monarch. So you kind of get to the totally wacky fringe
Right.
of this movement.
You got back to traditionalism in the end. There,
I
yeah.
know. I found it all kind of interesting, but eventually I grew up and I stopped being a young person. I had personal crises. I kind of woke up out of this strange 15-year fever dream, and now I'm on the fence. I've learned a bit of epistemic humility, maybe, and I don't really know what to make of all that kind of radicalism. So you can imagine reading Hayek's Bastards. I was like, it was almost like someone was revealing this sort of slightly embarrassing, rather naughty part of my own history, because that world went in some dark places, largely around race.
Yeah, no, I think that you are probably a good reader for that, because for some, people, the esoteric angles that I delve into are off-putting, or they seem too fringe to be meaningful or something. Or I think that's sometimes the response that people have. But it's not a coincidence, actually, that the internet opened up these portals in the late 1990s to people like yourself and myself and many of the people I'm writing about, that made this proliferation of intellectual subcultures and political identities and strange recombinations of seemingly disparate strands of thought possible. And not just possible, but gave them oxygen and space to grow and develop. So I think that when my motivation for writing the book was feeling that entangled strangeness of the early internet and the shockwaves of politics you're describing, the response to the Iraq War, the response to the global financial crisis, had actually acted as electric shocks often do to create the proliferation of combinations in the ecosystem that were being overlooked in what I thought was a rather crude pundit's line about there had been a peaceful period of globalization. Then 2016 came along with the election of Trump and the yes vote on Brexit. And suddenly now the pendulum has swung back to nationalism and away from the global. And I was sure that wasn't the whole story. And the characters that I pick out in the book, from Charles Murray to Peter Brimelow to Hans-Hermann Hoppe himself, are people who are not easily scanned as one thing or another thing, as either neoliberal or reactionary, either globalist or nationalist, separatist. They managed to kind of combine a commitment to the marketplace, a commitment to economic rationality, often with harking back to these supposedly superseded ideas of racial essences and biological essentialism. And that was the contradiction I really set out to try to work my way through.
It was the part of all of that thinking that I always kind of hated. I always felt like it was clearly tainted, because every now and then, you'd get some email newsletter from Lou Rockwell or something, and you'd be like, "Oh, these guys are racists." But I don't really see how the racism is necessarily follows from some of the economic political critiques. That actually seemed, as I said, to be somewhat aligned with the more leftist critiques that I had previously been reading. Now, you call the book Hayek's Bastards. You've mentioned Friedrich Hayek. He was born in 1899 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He lived a long time. He died in 1992. He is kind of mainly known in terms of political philosophy and economic thought with a critique, a kind of epistemic critique, basically saying that command economies, centralized economic planning, is doomed to fail because economic systems are too complex for any one person or one committee of people to actually run. They would never have all of the information required to efficiently run a big economic system. And he would say that is what a market provides much better through the price signal. Many, many millions of people, using their freedom and their money to decide how much things cost, how many, resources should be allocated here and there. So that was basically his primary thesis. Is that thesis sound? would you say? I mean, is that something that he legitimately contributed to the debate in the 20th century about how economies were best run?
I think absolutely. I mean, this is often referred to as the knowledge problem. So, the knowledge problem being if everyone's daily short-term and long-term needs are known best only by them and are difficult to aggregate through whatever means, however many even now sensors or mainframes you might have to do that computational work, then you need to leave some degree of individual autonomy built into the system to allow people to, process and then communicate or upload, as it were, their own needs to the rest of the society or the collective. And it's also sometimes referred to as the socialist calculation debate, as launched originally by his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, a few years earlier. And it's no exaggeration to say that, socialists have been wrestling with that critique ever since it was launched. So for over 100 years now, people who believe in the possibility of socialism have been forced to return again and again to this knowledge problem and to say, so what is your solution to this now? And there's been, of course, waves and waves of responses to that. Some to do with the advances in digital technologies, some to do with more faith in human nature, perhaps you could say, than what Hayek seemed to evince sometimes. But no doubt, it's incredibly meaningful, and like many of his arguments, drew on an understanding of society that was folding in insights from the time. So he was not just an economist, narrowly speaking. He actually trained or hoped to be a neurologist and a psychologist first, and became very interested in the way that nervous systems reacted to stimulus and spread signals throughout the organism, and in some ways moved from that analogy to the human collective as something that responds to signals now carried in price, and onward to, reflections on galaxies and so on. So
Wow, that's
he was
very
a thinker of
interesting.
systems. Yeah.
So, by calling your book Hayek's Bastards, are you saying that these other figures, like Murray Rothbard, an anarcho-libertarian, like Hans-Hermann Hoppe, this strange absolutist monarchist libertarian, very strange mix, and others, that they betrayed Friedrich Hayek in some way? They're downstream of him and betrayed him? Or, because sometimes reading the book, it seemed like you were happy to slightly frame Hayek himself as in a slightly villainous mode, slightly, like in a way these men were his bastard children, but they were also in a direct continuation from him. So which way is it?
Well, I think that, you need to talk a little bit about how his thinking progressed after his big breakthroughs that you just described. So the article and work for which he received the Nobel Prize, Memorial Prize in Economics in 1974, were things written, before the end of the Second World War. So the economics and knowledge stuff dates back to there, and you're right that that's still seen as his biggest contribution. So there are decades and decades, there are actually 50 years of production that follow that. And it's sometimes not looked at carefully enough about what was he writing for those remaining 50 years of his life. We all know about The Road to Serfdom, but that came out also in 1944. And again, decades and decades later, he dies. What is he writing in the interim? Well, one of the things that he becomes very interested in is the idea of cultural evolution. So rather than just thinking about the Great Society, as he and Mises used to describe a kind of a global commercial society as an aspirational endpoint for their politics and their thinking from the 20s to the 40s, Hayek starts to think about the world as subdivided into populations. And those populations, which are roughly mapped onto cultures, nations, and also races, are more and less adept at interpreting and responding to the price signals that economic information produces. So as he sees it, some parts of the world have developed through emulation over time, through a kind of Lamarckian inheritance, certain cultural traits of, thrift, foresight, entrepreneurial grit that allow them to become more economically successful, allow them to accumulate more, and thereby also allow them to reproduce more. So, and also, not incidentally, allow them to take over and dominate other populations in other parts of the world. So the world isn't just one undifferentiated blob of kind of would-be consumers and producers for Hayek, especially beginning in the 60s and to his death. It's actually subdivided into different groups, which he is willing to concede have a kind of hierarchy of capacity for economic activity, and that maybe some groups are able to succeed in economic terms and some simply are not. So by the 1980s, he's saying things like, there is one inheritance, which is the inheritance of Western civilization, and that is the one that cannot be replicated, at least not easily. And so things like foreign aid, things like development, things like the prospect of a kind of global economic evenness are not just unlikely because of the inability for one central organization to redistribute or allocate resources most efficiently, but also because there's something about some populations in the world that make them resistant to quickly adopting market activity.
This is what makes Hayek quite different from a lot of the more libertarian thinkers, if I've understood correctly. A lot of libertarian thought begins with a sort of thought experiment. It's called the Robinson Crusoe thought experiment, which basically makes the individual on an island the beginning of a sort of explanation of how economic development occurs. Whereas Hayek actually was smarter. He realized that at base human beings are communal, tribal, let's say in a negatively inflected way of describing it, tribal, but they were communal creatures, but that some of those communities over time developed institutions, laws, orders of thinking that restrained the merely tribal and allowed on top of it a civilized, let's say, mode of being that protected the individual. So he was aware that something like that had happened.
Yes,
he,
exactly.
I think, feared the possibility of the tribal overwhelming the individual. He, I guess, saw that as part of his anti-communist sort of view. But I guess the question is, and this is a question about the book in general, and your critique, if you like, of this way of thinking, is to what extent is Hayek's view, and some of the views which become quite extreme of his bastards, to what extent is it that they're wrong, or that they're just very unpleasant? This is what it's hard, I think, for me sometimes to gauge when I read what seems to be more left-wing sort of explanations of this intellectual heritage. Mm-hmm. Sometimes a view will be stated, like this view that some places in the world developed in one way and other places didn't develop, and that might mean that there was some kind of cultural inheritance factor in differentiations between outcomes and stuff. And I read it and I think, well, that's obviously true. I mean, it's unfortunate if you're an egalitarian, but it is true. But so is it that these ideas are wrong, or that they're just unpleasant facts?
I mean, in the case of Hayek, I mean, he wasn't a particularly unpleasant person in his presentation of these things, right? So, in fact, this is coming around to answering your question about are the bastards sort of legitimate heirs of a sort or illegitimate? So the people who followed him along the line of thinking that I'm just describing, I describe in the book as the cultural Austrians. And they end up clustering at the George Mason University through, generous funding from the Charles Koch Foundation. They managed to set up a school of Austrian economics. There's also one at NYU. And by the 1980s, they're following Hayek on this idea of cultural evolution, but doing so in a way that I think leaves open many different conclusions. So it's not just being used explicitly as a way to, let's say, fight USAID or to attack affirmative action programs or something. It's actually in a quite open-ended mode, which is like a sociological exploration. The Austrian insight is that meaning and value are subjective, and even the price mechanism is only the kind of second best way of accessing how people actually feel about things. It's not accessing the truth, because you can't access the truth. It's locked inside of our heads and our experiences in some ways.
Sounds quite postmodern, actually.
Well, so that's where this funny moment, and I didn't know about this stuff until I went digging around in their journals from the 80s and 90s, but they're reading postmodern theorists. They're reading Paul Ricoeur. They're reading Hans-Georg Gadamer. They're thinking about hermeneutics in ways that I found, as someone who, took graduate classes on German studies, like quite familiar. Why is that important? It's important because it's at that time that this meaningful schism takes place within the Austrian School of Economics. And so you can't sort of lump together Hayek, the George Mason people, and then Rothbard and Hoppe as if they're all in one group, because in fact they are quite aggressively not by the 1990s. The Hoppe and Rothbard have created or helped build the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, which sees itself openly in opposition to this cultural Austrian investigation happening at George Mason. So whether or not what the conclusions of George Mason type people were, just politically uncomfortable to me or wrong, is actually a conversation I would be able to have with those people, which include, for example, Peter Betke, who I have had interesting conversations with, and who is arguing things that I think are valid, like after the Soviet Union ends, is it possible to simply import a market economy overnight, or are there certain sociological realities on the ground that make that difficult? Perfectly reasonable question. Where it gets to me unreasonable is the open politicization of knowledge that happens with the attack of what I call the racial Austrians around Rothbard and Hoppe from Auburn, Alabama, against the George Mason University folks. What the brunt of their critique is that the cultural Austrians are overlooking what they claim is the kind of hard fact of racial difference, which they turn to, I believe falsely, really, the works of Ludwig von Mises in particular to substantiate. So they say, look, you guys are being too wishy-washy. You're getting lost in all this postmodern business. Let's be honest. Some races are different than others, and they're never going to be the same. And until we face that fact as our primary purpose, really, then we're never going to get anywhere. So the Hayek's bastards are people who actually adopt a position that Hayek himself always opposed, what he called scientism, which is the belief that you can just have this hard empirical facts and that are beyond interrogation that guide social policy and political decisions, regardless of their wobbliness in actuality. The way that the racial Austrians and also Charles Murray, to a great extent, embrace IQ as a kind of unquestionable bedrock truth about human nature falls afoul directly, I would say, of Hayek's warnings about scientism.
I remember, again, a young guy, kind of generally on the Republican right as a teenager, when the furore erupted over The Bell Curve, Charles Murray's book. I remember just being predisposed to be like, well, is it just true? Because it seemed like the debate was between people who said something was true and other people who said that cannot be true. I must say, in the end, I rejected all of this kind of radical thinking. For me, I just kind of came back to my Christianity, and it was like, no, we're all made in the image of God. Everyone is equally, has dignity as a result of that. All of this stuff is crap. But that for me is like a spiritual commitment. I don't really know on the level of just hard science. I just never know what is actually true. Do you see what I'm saying,
Sure.
Quinn? It's like it's hard
Absolutely.
to know when people are rejecting unpleasant science in favor of an idealism that they can't allow it to be the case that within certain populations, maybe slightly for genetic reasons, there are these different outcomes. I mean, again, I don't know if it's true, but
yeah,
couldn't it be true?
Yeah, no, and I think that we can see something similar to this happening now over retrospective discussions about the origins of COVID, for example, right? Where, serious people, including the WHO and the Department of Energy, have said, listen, the idea that this was a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or something is an hypothesis that one cannot simply reject out of hand. And there is inconclusive evidence for a series of different hypotheses. And there are people now, for political reasons, who will either say, absolutely, it's true, and I will not listen to anything except the fact that it's true. And there are people who will say, absolutely, that can never be true, and I will not listen to any argument that it could ever be true. And neither of those are really scientific arguments. Both of them are sort of rejecting confrontation with evidence and so on. So as far as the bell curve itself goes as a scientific work, there have been many books written by psychologists getting into the details of the way that Herrnstein and Murray used data and often tortured data for conclusions that, as this is where my argument comes in, that my book is the first book to use the correspondence and the archives of Herrnstein to see, like, well, what were they talking about when they were publishing this book? Who were they talking to? And what I found, and I show in the book, is that they already knew what they were going to say before they started investigating the topic. That the book was explicitly intended as a political intervention that they knew was going to be used as they wanted it to discredit the idea of racial equality as a policy outcome, especially in the field of education and workplace compensation.
Yeah, it all comes out of the civil rights movement and this idea
Absolutely.
of a larger federal government in the United States with new powers granted to it in order to ensure that previous racial disparities in basically social injustices were undone. At least they attempted to do so. It doesn't seem to have been very successful, really, but they attempted to do so, making the state more powerful, which of course offended the sensibilities of people like Murray Rothbard, who was an anarchist. Like, he literally thought there should be no state, which just seems crazy to me now, but when I was 24, I thought, well, maybe there should be no state, and which is exactly what Noam Chomsky was sometimes saying. You don't need states; you just need collective committees to discuss things. Now, what about Rothbard? So Murray Rothbard, this anarcho-libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, he was very influential. It always seemed to me somewhat unlikely that he himself was actually, like, really racist. It seemed like maybe he was cynical and got into bed with racists, especially in the American South, let's say, just to make his own political movement more powerful. What is the truth? I mean, it's called, I think, the outreach to the rednecks. So what happened there?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, I think it's best to think about people like Rothbard and Murray and Hayek and Brimelow. Well, let's bracket Hayek, but say Brimelow, Rothbard, and Murray, three big subjects of the book, as very much political thinkers first. And political thinkers who were willing to subordinate questions of scientific truth or conviction to their politics. That they were doing what you were describing many critics of, say, the bell curve did, which is say they start out with a political position and they say, okay, what science will help me advance my political goals? And for Rothbard is very interesting, right? Because as I recount in the book, in the 1960s, he has a different strategy. It's not outreach to the rednecks, it's outreach to the hippies. And his belief was that there are people in the streets protesting the U.S. government over the Vietnam War. They're burning their draft cards. They hate the state. And that's amazing. And we need to stoke the fires of that state hatred as much as possible and try to turn these hippy-dippy kind of like dropout kids into card-carrying anarchists. And he did everything right up to doing kind of entryism into a Maoist party to try to win people over from the inside. While doing that, he was engaged in a racial politics quite openly, right? And what was the racial politics? Well, it was encouraging black nationalism. He was vocally supportive of the idea of black secession from the United States in the South Republic of New Africa, it was sometimes called. He was pro Malcolm X, against Martin Luther King Jr., because he thought, and this is the core of the argument I'm making in the book, is that if you're going to get rid of states, as he quite sincerely wanted to do, then you're going to have something to replace them. So there will have to be some kind of social tissue, some kind of connective institutions that will do the stabilizing work that we have so long relied on states for. And one of the things that he comes back to for his entire life, from at least the 60s until his death in the 90s, is racial homogeneity is a very effective social glue. And it reduces distrust, it increases a sense of mutual confidence in one another, and it also makes an in-group identity more resilient against attacks from the outside. So as he was supporting Black nationalism in the South, he was supporting white nationalism in the North. And he said so directly at the time. 30 years later, he is very much working with the League of the South, the neo-Confederate group around Chronicles magazine, including Tom Fleming and Sam Francis and others, for the same reason. Justin Raimondo, his biographer and close friend, who incidentally was the guy who ran antiwar.com, going back to your point about the connection between anti-imperialism and Austrian libertarianism in the late 90s, very, very, very popular website in the late 90s and early 2000s. Justin Raimondo in his biography says, I know what he said in the 60s, and I heard him saying the same thing in the 90s, that the audience was just different, but it was the same case. So that that willingness to instrumentalize racial feeling or even racial science, which was part of the Rothbard package by the 1990s, is something that I think didn't sit well with a lot of other, let's say, neoliberals who were trying to reconcile actually the integrationist dreams of someone like MLK with the kind of market-friendly proposals that they were making. In fact, the standard neoliberal argument about race is, the market is colorblind. Once you enter, you compete, in equal arena as well as much as your other, people of different racial backgrounds, and that over time, meritocracy will kind of find talent and bring it to the top, and you will be rewarded commensurate to your abilities and your efforts and your talents. For people who genuinely believed in secession, in which include Hoppe, which include Rothbard, if you really believe that existing states need to be cracked up and broken up, then you're thinking more like, as Rothbard openly was in the 1990s, it's something like post-collapse Yugoslavia, where you're looking at Yugoslavia and you're saying, this is actually great. The Serbians are hanging out with the Serbians. The Croats are hanging out with the Croats. They're expelling people from the opposite religions and opposite nationalities. And it's showing what? That this Wilsonian dream of multicultural commercialism is always a thin gruel, and it'll always run out in the end. You're going to have to come back to something harder. I mean, the argument that really, or the puzzle that spawned the book for me was, why did neoliberals who had been fighting communism for 50 or for 45 years, from the end of the Second World War to 1989, not feel more excited when the Cold War ended? Why is it that when you read the Wall Street Journal account of the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting, Mont Pelerin Society being the neoliberal sort of debate society that Hayek founded in 1947, why are they also depressed? I didn't get it. And the answer, as I discovered, is they thought that the enemy had not been vanquished. It had just changed color. So there were new enemies now after the Soviet Union, and sort of official party-style communism was dead. In fact, it had been dead for decades, right? I mean, by the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, communist parties were, except for maybe a couple of Western European countries, more or less a dead letter. So who are the new enemies? Well, the new enemies were, first and foremost, the environmental movement, which we forget had a great deal of momentum in the late 80s, stuff around the greenhouse, the ozone layer and push against greenhouse gases. It was also the civil rights movement, which hadn't died after the 1960s and was actually in some ways going stronger, with affirmative action, with quotas, and with workplace discrimination laws. It was also anti-sexism, again, workplace harassment laws. It was things like the American Disabilities Act, which passes in the early 1990s. If you read Milton Friedman in the 90s, he's pointing to all these things. He's saying, if socialism is dead, why isn't it lying down? I think that's what Peter Brimelow was quoted as saying around the same time. State budgets are still huge. If you're Rothbard, you're saying the foreign policy beast is not dead either. They're just off finding new wars to fight. And the state and the deficit to GDP ratio is not going down at all. So we just have a new set of
But Quinn, is that so surprising? Because this tendency, which became known as neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s, it had always opposed the New Deal, hadn't it? It had always seen the erection within the United States of this new sort of social democracy. The United States never had it to the same degree as Western European countries, obviously. I mean, maybe because Western European countries were smaller and were more homogenous, and so could rely on some political energy there to get these structures in place. But nonetheless, the New Deal is gesturing towards social democracy, which the neoliberals, as they would be called, always opposed. So is it so surprising that when one enemy, the enemy outside, died, they would turn their attention to the enemy that had always existed?
To me, it wasn't surprising. No, you're absolutely right. And even more than the New Deal, the Great Society programs, right?
Oh, so yeah, of course, from the 60s, really, which President Johnson inaugurated, yeah.
Yeah, so it's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid that bring up the state share of GDP in the United States, not far off from its Western European counterparts like the UK. And people pointed to the fact that political scientists have for years said, if Thatcher and Reagan dismantled the welfare state as it was claimed, then why did the amount of state spending actually effectively not drop? So no, you're absolutely right that neoliberals, if they were focused on, the principles of austerity, balanced budgets, running the state more economically, had always a lot of targets, and many of them were domestic through the Cold War period as well. Things that they blamed for the economic irrationality of the conduct of even so-called capitalist countries. But this moment in the 1990s ended up being important because it helps explain why, when you were a reasonable person opposing the Iraq War in the early 2000s, or wondering about the bailout after 2008, or excessive levels of consumer debt and why the state was encouraging them and banks were making such money off of them, why when you went to find critiques of that in places like LewRockwell.com or in Ron Paul or antiwar.com, often it would come bundled up with pretty toxic racial politics, right? I mean, it's quite amazing. You can still do this if you want. Go on the Wayback Machine and just scroll through LewRockwell.com from 1990, and it's a baffling combination of themes, right? From like the collapse of the white race 1 minute to military spending the next, and immigration policy the next. And the reason was that this very important split happened, and John Gans has written about this now quite well. But I think if you don't understand this, you don't know how we got to where we are in American politics, which is that in the early 1990s, you had a faction of the Republican Party, conservatives, who did not want to abandon the global role for the American military establishment. So they were known then, and we know them as the
neoconservatives. Yeah,
the neocons, right? And it is absolutely true that, and this would be a Chomsky line, right, that in the 90s, the U.S. switched from anti-communism to democracy promotion or human rights wars to justify its presence globally, its frequent intervention. Why are there U.S. bombers in the Balkans? Why are they in Mogadishu? Why are they in Haiti? The answer to all these questions is, well, America just changed up the storyline. Instead of fighting communists, now we're defending human rights and democracy. And that was pretty obvious to some other members of the conservative movement who didn't want to go along with this neocon turn, this neoconservative turn. And they then called themselves paleoconservatives to distinguish themselves from the neoconservatives. And they became known as paleocons. And this is the group that Murray Rothbard starts hanging out with.
This includes like Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul,
Absolutely.
A kind of motley crew of anti-neoconservative Republicans.
Sam Francis.
And third party people, Reform Party people.
Exactly. And they are arguing against the continuation of America's aggressive overseas foreign policy, but they're also arguing for the reestablishment of a more ethnically homogeneous, religiously deepened version of American society that would have to go along with that. So there was both an external demand and an internal demand. The external was stop fighting these foreign wars. The internal demand was make America a white European-derived nation again. And either that could happen at the scale of the entire kind of logo map of the U.S., or, as the neo-Confederates believed, it would happen at the size of a rebooted U.S. South. Or if you're Rockwell and Rothbard, you say, hey, maybe we just need things no bigger than, metropolitan Dallas or whatever. And those things could become
or just an HOA, a libertarian HOA, just.
Exactly. No, and that's, I don't know if you've read this other book I wrote, Crack Up Capitalism, but I have a whole chapter about gated communities. And quite literally, people were theorizing HOAs as kind of laboratories of self-governance from inside of this paleo-libertarian community in the 1990s.
I know we don't have much more time, so I just want to, I got two questions for you. I hope you can give, maybe if you need to give me 2 more minutes. So first of all, this is a critique, okay? This is me criticizing Hayek's bastards, okay? And I do it in fear and trembling. I don't like conflict, even though this podcast is called Conflicted. As I was reading it, I felt that sometimes the case was a bit overstated. Sometimes what seemed to be a fringe movement in the right was portrayed as if it was much more leading the right over those decades. But mainly what I felt as I read it, that I thought I've read books like these before, and I was thinking of those right-wing books that try to explain everything from the 1960s through the prism of cultural Marxism or a kind of grand conspiracy amongst radical liberal leftists to take over our institutions and make us all woke. I thought, I think there's something similar here. And so maybe it's fruitful to read both kinds of books, but for me, the result is the radical fringe in America, which, because it is the kind of country it is, where the paranoid style of politics just sadly permeates the whole, the radical fringe is big, it kind of just lost its mind. Like when you read Hayek's Bastards and you just see the degree of weird convictions, just like when you do, you think back to some of the more extreme leftist sort of ideas that proliferated over the 90s, noughties, and teens, sometimes standing in the face of more scientific ways of understanding things and shutting down any debate, all that. It just seems so similar, like you're charting one splinter of a larger societal mental breakdown, but maybe portraying it as more influential than it was. Is that fair for me to ask? That was my feeling.
I think so. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a fair criticism. I mean, it is, as I said from the beginning, if the John Ralston Saul was the kind of template, then, one could read that and say, was Voltaire really the reason for McNamara, for example? Right? And the answer would be no. But the response, I think, would be it's an essay in its writing. And so it's designed not to provide, the final comprehensive analysis, but it's designed to make us think differently about things we thought we had already understood. And I think that in the case of, the way I would defend the method in the case of Hayek's Bastards would be, say, the chapter on the bell curve, for example, right? I mean, you as a teenager remember that Ferrari, as you say. And indeed, it stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for a whole year and is still in print today, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. So in that case, not really fringe, right?
Yeah,
actually
that's
about
true.
as mainstream as
Not
it gets.
Fringe, yeah.
And not hard to say that it brought language of race science back into the mainstream in a way that it hadn't been before. When it comes to the breakthrough out of which this book was really spawned of 2016-17, the Unite the Right protests, the emergence of the alt-right as a kind of power player in some ways inside of the MAGA movement, then there was a real kind of prominence from previously completely marginal and strange beliefs that I think needed to be accounted for. And when Brimelow, for example, was presented as the godfather of the alt-right regularly in the media, and was never presented as a business columnist for decades, then for me it's like, oh, we're really missing part of the story here. That in fact, in some ways, it's the opposite of the cultural Marxism argument, because what I'm not saying is that there were these people who only focused on culture. I'm saying in a way they were also focused on economics, and they're more mainstream than we realize, right? They were writing for Fortune and Forbes, and to treat them as if they were this strange virus that just popped out of the corners of America's mental derangement is actually letting the rest of America off the hook, I think. So I see what you mean, and I think I would love to read a dual review of like the strong version of the cultural Marxism from the right alongside this to kind of compare the way that they work with evidence. But I would still say that my book's better than theirs.
Well, Quinn, I'll save my last question for another time. Maybe you'll come back and tell us all about what Muskism is. That's the title of your new book. Obviously, you'll probably turn your withering critique on Elon Musk and everything he stands for. That's what I assume you're doing. Thank you for coming on Conflicted. I'm absolutely melting here. It's so hot. I'll bring this to an end. Thanks for coming on. I had no reason to be nervous at all. You've been a great conversation partner. Certainly your book, Hayek's Bastard, as an essay is worth reading. And for me personally, it was sort of shining a little bit of a light on a dark corner of my own personal past, which I did cringe a little bit to be reminded of. So thank you very much for that.
All right. It was my pleasure, Thomas. Nice to speak to you.